Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You're still single? What's wrong with you? Uncle Gary barked, his beer belly shaking with laughter as he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself far too much. The family was gathered around the long wooden table in my Aunt Carol's backyard, plates stacked with barbecue and coleslaw, the air thick with the scent of smoked ribs and the sound of overlapping conversations. Gary had been making these remarks for years, always loud enough for everyone to hear, always with that condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. He liked to think he was funny, the life of the party, but really, he was just a middle-aged man who got off on putting others down, especially women who dared not to follow his script for life. I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Then I tilted my head, gave him a slow smile, and said, "Nothing, but what's wrong with your wife?" "Because she's been flirting with me all night." The second the words left my mouth, the entire backyard seemed to freeze. A hush fell over the family, the kind of thick, uncomfortable silence that you could almost feel pressing against your skin. Even the crickets in the bushes seemed to stop chirping for a second. The smirk on Gary's face evaporated, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like panic. His eyes flicked toward his wife, Linda, who was sitting 2 seats down from me, her manicured nails tapping lazily against her glass of white wine. I hadn't actually planned on saying it, not like that, anyway. I had thought about firing back at Gary 100 times before, but it was always in my head, always in the shower or the car ride home, long after the moment had passed. But tonight, after years of enduring his taunts, something inside me just snapped. And honestly, I didn't regret a damn thing. Linda, to her credit, didn't look flustered at all. If anything, she seemed amused. She raised an eyebrow at me, lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't exactly innocence either. She swirled her wine in her glass and took a slow sip before leaning forward just slightly. "Oh, honey," she said in that syrupy voice of hers, "if I were flirting, you'd know it." Someone let out a nervous chuckle. I wasn't sure who because I was too busy watching Uncle Gary's face go from red to deep crimson. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He was staring at Linda like he was trying to read her mind, but she wasn't giving anything away. Instead, she just took another sip of wine and smiled at him, the kind of smile a woman gives when she knows exactly how to push a man's buttons. The moment stretched awkwardly, but then my cousin Mark let out a loud, forced laugh and clapped Gary on the back. "Come on, man. You walked right into that one," he said, trying to lighten the mood. A few others chuckled hesitantly, and just like that, the conversation shifted, people pretending like the moment hadn't just happened. But it had, and Gary knew it. For the rest of the evening, I could feel his eyes on me, his gaze burning holes into my skull every time I so much as glanced in Linda's direction. But here's the thing, Linda was acting weird. It wasn't just that she had played along with my comment. No, she kept throwing me these looks, these fleeting, knowing glances that sent a weird little shiver up my spine. I'd catch her eyes on me across the table, and instead of looking away, she'd hold my gaze just a second too long. When she reached across me for the salt, her fingers brushed against my arm, lingering just long enough for me to notice. At first, I thought maybe she was just messing with Gary, using me as a pawn in whatever passive-aggressive game they were playing. But then I started paying closer attention, and that's when I realized Linda wasn't just flirting with me. She was flirting with other people, too. The way she leaned in just a little too close when talking to my cousin's husband, the way she laughed a little too hard at my brother's jokes, the way her hand rested on my dad's shoulder for just a second longer than necessary. I wasn't the only one who noticed, either. I caught Aunt Carol watching Linda with pursed lips, her expression tight and disapproving. My mom, usually oblivious to everything, shot me a subtle look that I immediately recognized as, "Do you see this?" And Gary? He was fuming. He barely touched his beer after that, just sat there, stewing in his own embarrassment, his grip tightening around his bottle every time Linda so much as shifted in her chair. I knew I had stirred something up, but I wasn't quite sure what yet. I hadn't expected Linda to actually play into my joke, and I definitely hadn't expected her to enjoy it so much. But as I sat there, sipping my wine and watching the night unfold, I had the strangest feeling that I had just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And I had no idea where it was going to lead. The tension at the table didn't disappear, no matter how much everyone pretended it had, and I could feel it settling over the family like a thick, invisible fog that refused to lift. Uncle Gary kept up his usual bluster, throwing out comments about football and grilling techniques and whatever else he could to reestablish his dominance in the conversation, but his eyes kept drifting toward Linda, and every time she so much as smiled, his jaw clenched just a little tighter. He was trying to act like my comment hadn't gotten to him, like it had been nothing more than a throwaway joke, but I could see it in the way he gripped his beer bottle just a little too hard, in the way his knee bounced beneath the table, in the way he barely looked in my direction as if pretending I wasn't there would somehow erase what I had said. Linda, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying herself far too much, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that my little remark had done more than just annoy Gary. It had given Linda an excuse to lean into whatever game she was playing. She didn't shy away from the attention, didn't try to correct me, didn't act embarrassed or insulted or even surprised. Instead, she seemed almost entertained by the idea that people might believe it, as if the mere suggestion of her flirting with someone other than Gary wasn't something that horrified her, but rather something that amused her. She kept glancing my way, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read, and every time she did, I made sure to meet her gaze, refusing to look away first. If she wanted to play, I wasn't about to back down, and if nothing else, watching Uncle Gary squirm was starting to feel like its own kind of entertainment. I leaned into it just a little, just enough to keep things interesting without making it too obvious, letting my smiles linger a second longer than necessary, laughing a little softer at Linda's jokes, making sure she noticed when I looked at her. I wasn't flirting, not really, but I wasn't shutting it down either, and the more I played along, the more Gary seemed to unravel. His ears were turning red, his shoulders were tense, and even though he kept trying to act like he wasn't paying attention, I could feel his eyes darting between us every few minutes, as if he was trying to decipher whether or not there was actually something going on. But then, something I didn't expect happened, something that made the air around me shift, something that sent a chill down my spine before I even fully understood why. I felt a hand on my arm, a light but firm grip that pulled me to the side, away from the table, away from the laughter and the conversations and the watchful eyes. I turned and found myself face to face with Mark, my cousin, his usually relaxed expression tight with something that looked a lot like concern. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't ease into whatever he had pulled me aside to say. Instead, he just leaned in close enough that only I could hear and muttered under his breath, "You have no idea what you just did, do you?" His words sent a strange ripple through my stomach, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that made me suddenly feel like I had stepped onto unstable ground without realizing it. I frowned at him, tilting my head slightly, my mind immediately trying to backtrack, to pick apart the moment and figure out what, exactly, I had done that was worth pulling me aside over. "I made Gary mad," I said, stating the obvious because, as far as I could tell, that was all I had accomplished so far. Which, let's be honest, is not exactly a difficult thing to do. Mark shook his head, exhaling through his nose like he was debating whether or not he should even say what was on his mind. He glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if anyone was watching us, and when he seemed satisfied that we were out of earshot, he turned back to me, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "Look, I don't know if you were just messing with him or if you actually noticed something," he said, his tone measured but firm, "but you need to be careful when it comes to Linda." His words made something in my chest tighten, not because I was scared, not because I thought I had done anything wrong, but because I could tell, just from the way he was looking at me, that there was something here. Something deeper than just a jealous husband and a flirtatious wife. I crossed my arms over my chest, leaning back slightly as I studied him, trying to gauge whether he was being dramatic or if he actually knew something I didn't. What are you talking about? I asked, keeping my voice casual, though my pulse had picked up slightly. Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering again toward the table where Linda was still seated, sipping her wine with a satisfied little smirk that made it seem like she was entirely unaware of the conversation happening about her just a few feet away. Let's just say, he finally muttered, Linda has a history. The way he said it sent a prickle down my spine, and suddenly, my offhand remark about her flirting didn't seem quite so harmless anymore. I had only meant to throw Gary off balance, to turn his own mean-spirited teasing back on him, but now, I was starting to wonder if I had accidentally stepped on a landmine I hadn't even known was there. Mark didn't elaborate, didn't say anything else, just shook his head slightly like he had already said too much, then clapped a hand on my shoulder before walking away, leaving me standing there with more questions than I had answers. I glanced back at the table, my gaze settling on Linda once again, and for the first time since the night had started, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, I had opened a door that was never supposed to be opened. And worse, I had no idea what I was about to find on the other side. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the reunion, something subtle but impossible to ignore, something that felt like an undercurrent of tension running just beneath the surface of every conversation, every interaction, every stolen glance exchanged across the backyard. Gary had barely spoken since dinner, his usual loud, overbearing presence noticeably muted, his eyes darting toward Linda every few minutes as if he were trying to read her mind. Trying to figure out whether she was deliberately pushing his buttons or if there was something else going on, something deeper and more dangerous than just playful teasing. Linda, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed, sipping her wine with slow, deliberate movements, her expression one of quiet amusement, as though she knew exactly what she was doing and had no intention of stopping anytime soon. I had expected the moment to pass, for Gary to eventually shake off his embarrassment and regain control of the evening, but instead, the energy around them continued to shift, and it wasn't just between the two of them anymore. I started noticing the way other people were reacting, the way my Aunt Carol kept throwing pointed looks in Linda's direction, the way my mom whispered something under her breath to my dad before shaking her head like she was already exhausted by whatever drama was about to unfold. Even my cousin Mark, who usually spent these reunions drinking beer and cracking jokes, seemed strangely on edge, his eyes flicking between Linda and Gary with a tension that felt almost personal. I had the distinct feeling that there was something I was missing, something bigger than just an awkward exchange at dinner, something that had been lingering beneath the surface of this family for a long time, unnoticed by me, but clearly well known to everyone else. It wasn't until I made my way into the kitchen for another drink that I caught the first real glimpse of whatever it was I had stumbled into. I had been about to grab a beer from the cooler when I heard the hushed voices of my Aunt Carol and another relative I couldn't immediately place. They weren't trying to be loud, but their conversation carried just enough that I caught a few words before I even realized they were talking about Linda. I knew she couldn't keep it together forever, my aunt murmured, her voice thick with something that sounded an awful lot like judgment, her tone low but unmistakably sharp. The words stopped me in my tracks, and I instinctively stepped back, pressing myself slightly against the wall, not wanting to interrupt, but also not wanting to miss anything else they might say. She always does this, the other woman replied, her voice tinged with something that felt like a mix of exhaustion and resentment. She can't help herself. I don't know why Gary even bothers pretending he doesn't know. Something inside me clicked into place, a realization that sent a strange, electric sensation down my spine, a quiet understanding that whatever was happening between Linda and Gary wasn't just a one-time incident, wasn't just the result of my offhand comment at dinner. Linda had a pattern, a history, and from the sound of it, I was far from the first person to notice. I waited a few more seconds, hoping to catch something else, but the voices lowered even further, and I knew if I lingered any longer, I risked being caught eavesdropping. So, instead, I grabbed my drink and slipped back outside, my mind buzzing with possibilities, questions forming faster than I could make sense of them. I needed more information. So, I started asking questions. Not directly, of course, not in a way that would make it obvious I was digging, but in a way that allowed people to talk freely, to say things they probably thought I already knew, little pieces of gossip that were casually dropped into conversation. Fragments of a much larger puzzle that I was slowly beginning to put together. It turned out Linda had always been like this, restless, reckless, prone to seeking attention in ways that made people talk, ways that made people uncomfortable, ways that made her husband constantly have to play the role of the forgiving, oblivious man who either didn't see or chose not to. There were whispers of past flirtations, of nights out that had ended in ways they shouldn't have, of friendships that had turned into something more, of Gary being humiliated time and time again, but never willing to actually do anything about it. But the worst part wasn't just that Linda had a habit of straying. The worst part was the rumor that one of those so-called friendships had involved someone in the family. I didn't know who, not yet, but the way people talked around it, the way they avoided saying anything too specific, made it clear that whatever had happened, it was something that had been quietly swept under the rug. Something that had caused enough damage that nobody wanted to risk digging it back up. I should have let it go. I should have walked away before I got too deep. But I didn't. Instead, I kept looking. And that's how I found it. Later that night, when the reunion had started winding down and people had begun to slip inside to escape the summer heat, I found myself wandering into the den, a room filled with old family photos and memorabilia, the kind of place where history lived, where secrets had a habit of hiding in plain sight. I ran my fingers along the edge of a bookshelf, my eyes scanning over framed pictures of past reunions, of weddings and birthdays and Christmases long before my time. And then I saw it. An old family photo album, tucked just slightly out of sight, wedged between two stacks of outdated magazines, its worn leather cover almost begging to be opened. I pulled it out carefully, flipping through the pages, watching as the faces of my family stared back at me, frozen in time, captured in moments that now felt impossibly distant. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or if I was even looking for anything at all. But then, something slipped loose from between the pages, a small folded note, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. My breath caught in my throat as I unfolded it, my fingers trembling slightly as I read the words scrawled in Linda's handwriting. I should have picked you. But the note wasn't addressed to Gary. It was addressed to Mark. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was looking at, to make sense of what it meant, to understand how deep this mess truly went. I had set something in motion, something I hadn't fully understood, something that now had me standing at the edge of a revelation I wasn't sure I wanted to face. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no turning back now. I stared at the note in my hands for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the words pressing down on me, filling my head with 1,000 questions that I wasn't sure I wanted answers to, but at the same time, I knew I wouldn't be able to walk away from this without getting them. The note was old, the edges slightly frayed, the ink a little faded, but there was no mistaking the name written at the top in Linda's unmistakable handwriting. It was addressed to Mark, and that single fact alone made everything I had been hearing suddenly snap into focus in a way that made my stomach churn. I needed to talk to him. Mark wasn't hard to find. He had planted himself on the back porch with a beer in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through whatever nonsense was keeping him distracted enough to pretend this night wasn't unraveling at the seams. He didn't notice me at first, didn't even glance up until I stepped directly in front of him, blocking his view of whatever meaningless updates he had been pretending to care about. When he finally did look up, his face twisted into a smirk, the kind of forced grin that people wear when they know they're about to be dragged into a conversation they really don't want to have. "Well, if it isn't my favorite cousin," Mark said, his voice carrying that lazy amusement he always fell back on when he didn't want to deal with something serious. "You look like you've got something on your mind. Should I be worried?" I didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk or any kind of buffer that would ease us into the inevitable confrontation. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the note, and dropped it onto the table beside him, watching as his smirk faded the second his eyes landed on the words written across the page. His reaction told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Where did you get this?" His voice was lower now, quieter, edged with something that almost sounded like panic. He didn't reach for the note, didn't try to take it back, just stared at it like it was a grenade that might go off at any second. "It was in one of the old photo albums," I said, my tone even, my eyes locked onto his face, searching for any sign that he might lie to me. "Want to tell me what the hell it means?" Mark exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face before finally reaching for his beer and taking a long sip, as if the alcohol might somehow make this conversation easier. "It means exactly what it says," he admitted after a long pause, his voice tight, his jaw clenched like he was already regretting saying anything at all. "Linda and we had a thing. A long time ago. Before she married Gary." I should have been surprised, should have felt some kind of shock at the revelation, but in truth, it only confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The way Linda looked at Mark, the way Mark had reacted when I brought up her flirting, the way my Aunt Carol had whispered about Linda's inability to keep it together, it had all been leading to this. "And by thing, you mean?" I let the sentence hang in the air, forcing him to fill in the blanks, to say the words out loud instead of hiding behind vague implications. Mark let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "I mean, it wasn't serious, at least not at first," he admitted, his tone laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "We were just messing around, nothing too deep, nothing we thought would go anywhere. But then Gary showed up, and suddenly, she was all about him. Next thing I know, they're engaged, and I'm supposed to just pretend like nothing ever happened." I studied him for a long moment, watching the way his fingers tapped against the side of his beer bottle, the way his gaze kept shifting away from mine, like he didn't really want to be having this conversation, but knew there was no getting out of it now. "And you were in love with her," I said, more statement than question, because I could see it written all over his face, in the way he carried himself, in the way he talked about her even now. Mark didn't answer right away, just let out another one of those hollow laughs before shaking his head. "I don't know if love is the right word," he said, though the hesitation in his voice made it clear he wasn't being entirely truthful. "But yeah, it screwed me up for a while. And now, she's out there playing whatever game she's playing, and I don't want any part of it." But the problem was, Linda was playing a game, and I was starting to realize that it wasn't just about Gary anymore. It wasn't just about stirring up trouble, or making her husband jealous, or proving some kind of point about her own power in the relationship. She was testing the waters, seeing if she still had that hold over Mark, seeing if she could still wrap him around her finger after all these years. And judging by the look on his face, she might not have been entirely wrong to think she could. As I processed everything Mark had just told me, I became acutely aware of another set of eyes on me, a gaze so intense that it sent a shiver down my spine before I even turned my head. Across the yard, standing just beyond the glow of the porch lights, was Uncle Gary, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked onto me like he was trying to bore straight into my skull. He wasn't just mad anymore. He was scared. Scared of what I knew, scared of what I might do with it, scared that I might just be the person to finally blow this whole thing wide open. Before I could even begin to figure out what my next move should be, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration rattling against my leg like a warning bell. I pulled it out, expecting some meaningless notification, but the second I saw the name on the screen, my stomach twisted itself into a knot so tight it made it hard to breathe. "Linda." I hesitated for only a second before opening the message, my pulse hammering as my eyes scanned over the words she had sent. "Meet me outside." And just like that, I knew this night wasn't over. Not even close. The air outside was thick with the humid weight of the late summer night, the kind that clung to your skin and made everything feel just a little heavier, a little more intense, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped onto the back porch, my eyes immediately drawn to the figure leaning against the railing, her silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the patio lights. Linda stood there, a half-empty wine glass dangling loosely from her fingers, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, her lips curled into that same knowing smirk that had been driving Gary insane all evening. She turned her head slightly at the sound of the door closing behind me, her gaze flickering over me in a slow, deliberate way, like she was sizing me up, like she was considering exactly how much of this game she wanted to keep playing. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the thrill of pushing boundaries that had her acting this way, but either way, I knew what she was doing, and I wasn't about to let her think I didn't. "You really got under his skin tonight," she murmured, her voice smooth and teasing, just slightly slurred around the edges, like she had been drinking just enough to make herself bold, but not enough to lose control. She took a slow step forward, closing the space between us, her fingers trailing lightly along my arm as she tilted her head, her expression unreadable but undeniably calculated. I smiled, letting the silence stretch for just a moment longer than was comfortable, then leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure she was paying attention. "I know," I said, my voice calm and steady, my words deliberate. "That's why I did it." For the first time all night, Linda actually looked surprised, like she hadn't expected me to admit it, like she had been anticipating something softer, something more coy, something that would let her keep the upper hand. But I wasn't playing into whatever script she had written in her head, and I could see the moment she realized it, the way her smirk faltered just slightly before she regained control. She let out a low, breathy laugh, shaking her head slightly as she swirled the wine in her glass, watching the liquid slosh lazily against the sides. "You're something else, you know that?" she said, her tone somewhere between admiration and amusement. "Most people in this family are too afraid to push back against him. But you just went straight for the jugular." I shrugged, watching her carefully, waiting to see how far she was willing to take this. "Maybe he should have thought twice before running his mouth," I said, my voice light but firm, making it clear that I wasn't about to apologize for anything. Linda hummed in agreement, her eyes lingering on mine for a second too long, and I could see it now, the exact game she was playing, the exact way she was using me to get whatever reaction she wanted out of Gary. She wasn't flirting with me because she actually wanted me, she was doing it because it made him furious, because it gave her some kind of twisted satisfaction to know she could still control his emotions after all these years. I took a step back, putting just enough distance between us to make it clear that I wasn't interested in being her pawn. "You don't actually want me," I said, watching her carefully, my voice steady but sharp. "You just want to piss off Gary. And I get it, I really do. But if you're so unhappy, maybe do something about it instead of using other people to get a reaction." For the first time all night, Linda didn't have an immediate response. Her smirk faded slightly, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Maybe shock, maybe anger, maybe something deeper that she didn't want anyone else to see. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, but then stopped herself, her grip tightening slightly around the stem of her wine glass as she exhaled slowly. I didn't wait for her to find the right words. Instead, I turned and headed back toward the house, knowing that whatever needed to be said had already been said, knowing that she had just been called out in a way she probably wasn't used to. As I reached the back door, I glanced up and immediately locked eyes with Uncle Gary, who was standing just inside the house, watching through the window like a man on the verge of losing his mind. His face was red, his expression unreadable but undeniably furious, his hands clenched into fists at his sides like he was barely holding himself together. I smiled at him, slow and deliberate, then lifted my hand in a small, mocking wave before pushing the door open and stepping inside. But just as I passed him, just as I moved close enough that only he could hear, I leaned in slightly and whispered, "By the way, you might want to check Mark's messages." Just a hunch. The way his entire body stiffened, the way his nostrils flared, and his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, was one of the most satisfying things I had ever seen. He didn't say a word, didn't react beyond the way his fists tightened at his sides, but I didn't need him to. I had already won. I walked through the house with the kind of ease that came from knowing I had just permanently shifted the balance of power, knowing that this family reunion was never going to be the same again. As I reached the front door, I could already hear the sharp edge of Linda's voice carrying through the house, The way she was calling Gary's name, her tone laced with something that sounded an awful lot like anger. The night wasn't over for them, but it was for me. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I smirked to myself, the sound of raised voices fading behind me, knowing that next year, Uncle Gary would probably think twice before making me the target of his jokes.